Concordia Station was the sort of place that made architects weep with joy and diplomats weep with exhaustion. Built in the gravitational sweet spot between three gas giants, it served as the galaxy's premier neutral ground for interspecies negotiation. The station's designers had thoughtfully included atmospheric processors for 43 different respiratory systems, gravity generators that could accommodate everything from feathered flyers to crystalline rock crawlers, and enough meeting rooms to host simultaneous conferences for species that would, literally, dissolve each other on contact. What made Concordia truly special, however, was its adherence to the genetic superiority protocols, a delightfully scientific system that determined diplomatic precedence based on evolutionary advancement. The protocols were, their creators insisted, a perfectly objective measure of species development, based on factors like cranial capacity, natural weaponry, regenerative abilities, and something called predatory dominance quotient. The fact that these protocols had been drafted by a committee of apex predators was, they assured everyone, entirely coincidental. The current crisis drawing delegates from across the galaxy was the Kepler 442 territorial dispute, a charming disagreement over who had the right to strip mine a solar system that contained enough rare minerals to power entire civilizations. The competing claims had escalated to the point where three separate apex predator coalitions were threatening to turn the dispute into a shooting war that would incinerate half the outer rim. High Admiral Vorthak Nell of the Saurian hegemony had arrived at Concordia Station with all the subtle grace of a supernova. Standing 12 feet tall and weighing approximately as much as a small spacecraft, he was evolution's answer to the question, what if we made a crocodile the size of a house and gave it a PhD in military strategy? His species had earned their position at the top of the genetic superiority protocols through the simple expedient of being unkillable death machines with the tactical acumen of chess grandmasters. Flanking Vorthaknell were his fellow apex commanders, Zithara of the crystalline swarm, whose silicon-based physiology made her essentially a living weapon capable of reshaping matter at the molecular level, and Gorvakthul of the void hunters, whose species had evolved in the vacuum of space and could survive literally anywhere in the galaxy. Together they represented the absolute pinnacle of galactic evolution, the undisputed masters of warfare, diplomacy, and general intimidation, which made the presence of Dr. Rebecca Torres somewhat perplexing. Rebecca sat in the station's main conference room reviewing her notes while the other delegates filed in around her. At 5 feet 6 inches tall and weighing about as much as one of Vorthaknell's claws, she represented humanity's contribution to the negotiations. Her species occupied the rather embarrassing position of Tier 23 in the genetic superiority protocols, somewhere between the pacifist philosopher collective and the gelatinous blob confederacy. The station's protocol officer, a nervous centaurian named Kleptar, was having considerable difficulty figuring out where to seat her. According to the genetic superiority protocols, she should be placed somewhere near the back of the room with the other minor species delegates. But, according to the territorial registry, humanity held actual claims to several planets in the Kepler 442 system, which technically made her a principal party to the negotiations. This is highly irregular, Kleptar muttered, consulting his official handbook for the 7th time. The protocols are quite clear about seating arrangements based on evolutionary precedents, but the territorial claims are legitimate, and the legal precedents are, perhaps, suggested Vorthaknell, with the sort of magnanimous condescension that apex predators had perfected over millennia. The human delegate could serve as an observer. After all, her species lacks the cognitive capacity for complex negotiations. She could take notes for the real diplomat. Rebecca looked up from her tablet with the mild expression of someone who had just heard something interesting. That's very thoughtful of you, Admiral. Though I should mention that I have a PhD in xenopsychology with a specialization in interspecies behavioral analysis. I'm quite capable of taking my own notes. The conference room fell silent. The other delegates exchanged glances that ranged from puzzled to amused. A human with advanced degrees? How quaint! It was like watching a particularly clever pet perform tricks. Of course, Vorthaknell rumbled, his massive head nodding in what passed for diplomatic courtesy. I'm sure your species has developed its own interpretations of higher learning. Please, do take whatever notes you feel capable of managing. Rebecca smiled politely and returned to her tablet. Around the room, the other delegates began settling into their assigned positions based on the rigid hierarchy of the genetic superiority protocols. The apex predators claimed the central positions, the mid-tier species arranged themselves in order of evolutionary precedence, and the minor species delegates huddled in the corners like nervous prey animals. The opening ceremony was a masterpiece of diplomatic theater. Each species representative stood to formally announce their claims to the Kepler 442 system, accompanied by elaborate displays of their natural advantages. Vorthakanel's presentation included a demonstration of his species' armor plating, which could deflect military-grade energy weapons. Zythara showed off her molecular manipulation abilities by casually restructuring the conference table's surface into crystalline patterns. Gorvak Thul simply stood there, radiating the sort of casual menace that came from being able to survive in the vacuum of space. When Rebecca's turn came, she stood up with her tablet and delivered what amounted to a PowerPoint presentation about mining rights and territorial law. No demonstrations of physical prowess, no displays of natural weaponry, just charts and graphs and legal precedents. The other delegates politely stifled their laughter. "Thank you, Dr. Torres," Vortaknel said when she finished. "That was very thorough. Now, shall we proceed to the actual negotiations?" The first session began with the traditional approach to interspecies diplomacy, elaborate threats disguised as reasonable discourse. Each apex predator delegate took turns explaining why their species' superior evolution gave them the obvious right to claim the Kepler 4.42 system. The arguments were backed by detailed analyses of military capabilities, economic resources, and general intimidation factors. Rebecca listened to each presentation with the sort of focused attention that made the other delegates vaguely uncomfortable. She took notes, asked occasional clarifying questions, and generally behaved like someone who was genuinely interested in understanding their positions. "Admiral Vorthakanel," she said during a brief recess, "I'm curious about the Saurian hegemony's expansion patterns. Your species has conquered 47 star systems in the past century, but your territorial claims always seem to cluster around systems with specific mineral compositions. Is there a particular resource requirement that drives your expansion?" Vorthakanel's reptilian features arranged themselves into what might have been surprise. "You've studied our territorial expansion?" "Oh, I make it a point to research all the major players in galactic politics," Rebecca replied cheerfully. "Your species' approach to resource acquisition is particularly fascinating from a behavioral perspective. The pattern suggests a biological imperative rather than purely strategic expansion." The Admiral found himself oddly pleased by her attention to detail, even as something about her tone nagged at him. She spoke like a researcher discussing laboratory subjects, not a minor species delegate addressing her superiors. When the session resumed, Rebecca began asking more questions. Not challenges exactly, but the sort of inquiries that made the apex predators explain their reasoning in increasing detail. She wanted to understand their decision-making processes, their cultural priorities, their psychological motivations. "Commander Zythara," she said, consulting her notes, "the crystalline swarm's hive mind structure is remarkable, but I'm curious about the decision-making hierarchy. When individual nodes disagree with the collective assessment, how do you resolve the cognitive dissonance?" Zythara's crystalline form shimmered with what might have been confusion. The collective does not experience disagreement. Unity of purpose is our strength." "Fascinating," Rebecca murmured, making another note. "So individual analysis is subordinated to group consensus. That's a significant limitation in adaptive problem-solving." The crystalline commander's shimmer intensified. "Limitation? Our unity is what makes us superior to chaotic individual-thinking species?" "Of course," Rebecca agreed, "though I wonder how you handle situations that require rapid tactical adaptation. Group decision-making processes tend to be slower than individual responses, especially in crisis scenarios." By the end of the first day, the other delegates were beginning to feel oddly defensive. This human had a disturbing way of making their greatest strengths sound like evolutionary dead ends. Her questions were perfectly polite, academically rigorous, and absolutely devastating in their implications. The second day of negotiations began with Vorthakanel attempting to reassert dominance through traditional intimidation tactics. He delivered a lengthy speech about the Saurian hegemony's military superiority, complete with detailed descriptions of their conquest capabilities and threat assessments. Rebecca listened attentively, occasionally nodding as if she was taking notes on a particularly interesting lecture. When he finished, she raised her hand like a student asking for clarification. "Admiral, that was an excellent overview of Saurian military doctrine. I'm particularly interested in your species' approach to multi-front warfare. Your historical records show remarkable success in single-system campaigns, but your expansion has always been sequential rather than simultaneous. Is that a strategic choice or a logistical limitation? Vorthaknel's confident expression faltered slightly. Our approach is methodical. We ensure complete control of each system before moving to the next. Sensible, Rebecca agreed. Though it does suggest resource constraints, large-scale simultaneous operations require significant logistical support, which implies that your military infrastructure may be more limited than your conquest record suggests. The Admiral found himself explaining Saurian resource allocation in detail, trying to justify what he was beginning to realize might be perceived as weakness. How had this conversation gotten away from him? Of course, Rebecca continued, that's not necessarily a disadvantage. Conservative expansion reduces the risk of overextension, though it does make your species vulnerable to coordinated multi-vector attacks from smaller but more agile forces. The room had gone very quiet. The other delegates were watching this exchange with growing fascination. The human was systematically deconstructing the Admiral's intimidation display, turning it into a tactical analysis that made the mighty Saurian hegemony sound like a lumbering giant with feet of clay. Dr. Torres, Vorthaknel said, his voice carrying a warning edge, are you questioning the military capabilities of the Saurian hegemony? Rebecca looked genuinely surprised. Not at all, Admiral. I'm simply trying to understand your strategic parameters. Every species has limitations based on their evolutionary development. The key to successful negotiations is understanding those limitations and finding mutually beneficial solutions. She turned to address the room at large. That's actually why I'm here. Humanity has been studying galactic politics for several decades now, and we've developed some interesting insights into interspecies dynamics. The delegates shifted uncomfortably. There was something in her tone that suggested this was about to become much more than an academic discussion. You see, Rebecca continued, each of your species has achieved dominance through specialization. Admiral Vorthaknel's people are magnificent warriors, but their entire culture is built around conquest and control. Commander Zythara's crystalline swarm has achieved perfect unity, but at the cost of individual innovation. Gorvak Thul's void hunters have adapted to survive anywhere, but their nomadic nature makes them incapable of building lasting civilizations. She paused, letting her words sink in. These aren't weaknesses exactly, they're evolutionary trade-offs, but they are limitations. Gorvak Thul spoke for the first time since the negotiations began. And what limitations do humans have? Rebecca's smile was perfectly pleasant and absolutely terrifying. We're terrible at specialization. We can't breathe underwater like the Aquatic Collective. We can't survive in vacuum like your people. We can't regenerate like the Salamander Kingdoms. We're not particularly strong, or fast, or resilient. We're basically evolutionary generalists in a galaxy full of specialists. The room waited for her to continue. But here's the thing about generalists, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the sudden silence. We're adaptable, we learn, we study, we figure out how to turn everyone else's specializations against them. She pulled out her tablet and began displaying a series of charts and graphs. For example, Admiral Vorthaknel's species has a psychological predisposition toward hierarchical dominance displays. It's hardwired into your neural structure, which means that in negotiations, you'll always try to establish superiority first and find solutions second. The Admiral's massive form shifted uncomfortably. That is an oversimplification, is it? Rebecca asked. Your opening position in these negotiations was a threat display. You've spent more time explaining why you deserve the Kepler 442 system than you have discussing how to share it. Even now you're more concerned with maintaining your dominant position than with finding a mutually beneficial solution. She turned to Zythara. The crystalline swarm's hive mind structure makes you incredible at coordinated action, but terrible at individual initiative. You can't adapt to unexpected situations because your entire decision-making process depends on collective consensus. In negotiations, that means you'll always revert to established patterns rather than exploring creative solutions. Zythara's crystalline form flickered with what might have been agitation. Our unity is our strength. Your unity is your limitation, Rebecca corrected gently. You can't think outside the collective box because you don't have individual boxes to think outside of. She turned to Gorvak Thul. And the Void Hunter's nomadic adaptation makes you excellent at survival, but terrible at long-term planning. You think in terms of immediate resource acquisition rather than sustainable development, which is why you've never held territory for more than a few generations. The silence in the room was absolute. 3 apex predator species, the undisputed masters of galactic civilization, were being psychoanalyzed by a representative of a species that ranked below gelatinous blobs. Rebecca continued, "Let's talk about solutions. The Kepler 442 system contains enough resources to supply all of our needs, but only if we approach the distribution intelligently. The Saurian hegemony needs heavy metals for their military-industrial complex. The crystalline swarm requires silicon compounds for their reproductive cycles. The Void Hunters need rare earth elements for their survival technology, and humanity needs energy sources for our expanding colonies." She pulled up another chart. "Here's what I propose. Joint development with specialized extraction zones. Each species gets priority access to the resources they need most, while sharing the overall infrastructure costs. We establish a neutral administrative zone managed by species with no territorial claims, and we create a profit-sharing agreement that benefits everyone." The apex predators stared at her in confusion. This wasn't how negotiations were supposed to work. There was supposed to be posturing, threats, demonstrations of superiority, and eventual capitulation by the weaker parties. "Dr. Torres," Vorthaknell said slowly, "you're suggesting cooperation?" "I'm suggesting efficiency," Rebecca replied. "Competition is expensive, cooperation is profitable, and at the end of the day we're all here because we want the same thing, access to resources that will benefit our respective civilizations." She stood up and began pacing the room, her movements casual but purposeful. "The beautiful thing about being evolutionary generalists is that we don't have to win. We just have to make sure everyone else wins too. Because when apex predators are busy fighting each other, they're not paying attention to the little species that are quietly building alliances and securing resources." The room's atmosphere had shifted completely. The apex predators were no longer looking at Rebecca as a minor annoyance to be dismissed. They were looking at her as someone who had just revealed that the entire power structure of galactic civilization might be built on flawed assumptions. "You've been playing a dominance game," she continued, "but we've been playing a cooperation game. While you were busy proving who was strongest, we were busy figuring out how to make strength irrelevant." She returned to her seat and pulled up one final chart. "Humanity currently has trade agreements with 43 species, mutual defense pacts with 17 civilizations, and cultural exchange programs with 62 different worlds. We're not the strongest species in the galaxy, but we're rapidly becoming the most connected." The implications hit the room like a physical blow. If humanity could build alliances with dozens of species, if they could create networks of cooperation that bypass traditional power structures, then the entire concept of apex predator dominance became obsolete. "You're suggesting," Zithara said, her voice carrying new uncertainty, "that individual strength is less important than collective cooperation?" "I'm suggesting," Rebecca replied, "that evolution doesn't stop at the individual level. Species that learn to cooperate effectively have advantages that no amount of individual strength can overcome." Gorvek Tool leaned forward. "And if we refuse your proposal?" Rebecca's smile was perfectly pleasant. "Then you'll spend the next decade fighting each other over the Kepler 442 system, while humanity quietly establishes mining operations in 47 other systems that you haven't noticed yet. We've been exploring the galaxy for decades, Admiral. We know where all the good resources are." The silence stretched for a long moment. 3 apex predator species, the undisputed masters of galactic civilization, were realizing that they'd been outmaneuvered by a species they'd dismissed as evolutionary failures. "Dr. Torres," Vorthaknell said finally, "you're saying that humans have been planning this?" "Every bit of it," Rebecca confirmed. "Though I have to admit, you made it easier than we expected. Your species' predictable behavior patterns were a significant advantage in our strategic planning." She consulted her tablet one more time. "The Terran Colonial Administration has prepared comprehensive development proposals for 17 systems in this sector. We're ready to begin joint operations as soon as the agreements are signed." Around the room, the apex predators were frantically trying to contact their respective governments. The balance of galactic power had just shifted, and everyone wanted to be on the winning side. "One more thing," Rebecca said, addressing the room. "The genetic superiority protocols will need updating. intelligence-based cooperation is a more advanced evolutionary strategy than individual dominance. Humanity should probably be reclassified as Tier 1. Admiral Vorthaknil looked at the human delegate with something that might have been respect. Dr. Torres, I believe formal protocol requires me to acknowledge your superior negotiation capabilities. Rebecca nodded graciously. That's very professional of you, Admiral. The massive Saurian slowly lowered himself to one knee, his 12-foot frame bowing before the tiny human diplomat. Around the room, the other apex predators followed suit, their evolutionary pride finally succumbing to the reality of human psychological superiority. The Saurian hegemony, Vorthaknil announced formally, acknowledges the strategic supremacy of the Terran colonial administration in these negotiations. Rebecca stood and accepted the formal surrender with the same pleasant smile she'd worn throughout the entire process. Thank you, Admiral. Now, shall we discuss the contract details? As she began outlining the specific terms of the joint development agreement, the other delegates realized they were witnessing the birth of a new galactic order. The age of apex predator dominance was ending, replaced by something far more dangerous, an era of intelligent cooperation led by a species that had turned weakness into strength. The galaxy had just learned that evolution's greatest achievement wasn't the perfect predator, it was the species smart enough to make predation irrelevant. And somewhere in the depths of space, human diplomats were already scheduling similar negotiations with dozens of other civilizations, each one convinced that they were the apex predators and humanity was just another prey species. The universe, it seemed, was about to become a much more cooperative place, whether anyone else wanted it to be or not.